Hi, I'm Scott Barry Kaufman from the Imagination Institute. At the Imagination Institute, we're dedicated to making progress on the growth, improvement, and measurement of imagination across all sectors of society. Toward that aim, we've been hosting a series of imagination retreats. These retreats consist of discussions with some of the world's most imaginative thinkers across a wide range of fields, from psychology to comedy to physics to spirituality, among others. We've had a lot of exciting discussions about how imagination operates within each field and how we can help young people develop imagination. We've also been discussing the importance of imagination in society more generally. What you're about to watch is edited footage of one of these imagination retreats. In addition, all the videos and reports of all the retreats will be available on our website at imagination-institute.org.
So just from the other side of the jungle, for 50 years, not only me, but people who have worried about the questions that Danielle worries about have felt very uncomfortable with the existing mathematical models, not quite out of ignorance, but because they didn't feel right, didn't feel like that's what the mind was doing. And so, a bunch of us have been sitting waiting for something that feels right mathematically.
Yeah, I've often thought of it as, in the language of business, as like that we don't have a production problem, we have a distribution problem. I think we have a lot of cool ideas out there that are just waiting to be distributed and sold. I mean, maybe a marketing problem as well as a distribution problem. It's both. But it's not, this is why sometimes when I think about what am I trying to do, or what are my grad students trying to do, if we want to put the next little pebble in the wall, is that really what we should do, or should we try to explain what Isaac Newton thought of? Because that's a lot better than my pebble. How could you have the most impact for a unit of effort? And I sort of think being in the distribution business, if you're a communicator, I think my own talent may be more in communicating than in creation, or it's a different kind of creation. There are much deeper and more powerful mathematicians. And that's great, but I would like to help them get their message across.
Is there a good example of a successful distribution process in math?
You're nodding. What do you think of?
Tons.
Yeah.
I would point to dynamical systems as one of the great examples, where back in the 1960s and before, this was squarely the province of pure mathematics. You had pure mathematicians doing dynamical systems in math departments. Starting in the 1960s, it began breaking out. You fast forward to 1980, now dynamical systems is cutting-edge applied mathematics. You've got great stuff happening there. Fast forward to now, and if there's dynamical systems happening on my campus, it's not happening in the math department. We teach a dynamical systems course to second-year undergraduates in engineering. And some of the material in there is stuff from the 1960s that was cutting-edge pure math research.
It's when people talk about interdisciplinary work, and every administrator at every university says, we support interdisciplinary work, not realizing what a tremendously difficult thing it is, emotionally and interpersonally, to make it work. Because you end up often having to do work that your colleagues will think is kind of trivial. Because like the math that's needed to help an ecologist or to help a psychologist might look like, are you kidding? That stuff
differential equations.
Yeah, the mathematicians don't respect that because they're happy in the silo. But the applied mathematicians live for it. So obviously I'm a big believer in the importance of trying to do this.
It's listening to a large degree, and hearing what it is that the way in which these same ideas are being thought about in different fields, which is actually why I think this is going to be important too, is that having a different view on the same kinds of questions that we're trying to address from different disciplines can be very important for us to understand how to move forward. And so I think open-mindedness and the capacity to listen, I think, is important. And not necessarily to jump to the conclusion that you know the right direction to move forward, or that you even know the right question.
Do you think the reason you feel like there aren't many people doing engineering and cognitive neuroscience, because I encountered this also in my own work, is that there is no central venue for discussion, right? I can't type in different departments and look for people. Like, you have to know Dani personally to know that she is an person in an engineering department doing this work, or you have to know about someone's work very individually. We don't attend the same conferences. We don't publish in the same journals, right? Like in astrophysics, there are 3 journals you write in, right? Journal of I mean, they're just very clear. So you know the players. And I'm very curious what the thought is on this disconnect, the fact that they do exist, but there's no venue aside from the Imagination Institute and some pockets of places that are embracing these multidisciplinary approaches, and then also, of course, how to go about changing that.
Let's take a couple minutes for you guys to think through, a time where you were what the process of you trying to actually find a problem that's interesting to work on in the first place, and what kind of code that takes.
So what drives me is, why are you making it so damn complicated? There's something simpler here that nobody has thought about and nobody has understood. You're all busy fussing, making the problem harder. You should make it simpler, because even that's not understood. So I love simplicity, and I've made a career out of asking really simple things that people tell me, why are you doing that? That's already understood. And they're invariably, wrong. That's not true. There's lots of room at the bottom for asking elementary things and thinking about them. This sounds overconfident, and it probably is. I really believe a lot of creativity involves a kind of obnoxious confidence to try something daring, to do something disruptive. And in my case, it's usually disruptive going down rather than disruptive going up. Like, a lot of people are creative by doing a new thing that goes beyond. I like to go below.
I used to be a cyclist, and cycling, riding my bike for long hours of time was the way for me to basically keep my body active enough so that I wasn't thinking, I don't think well sitting still. I find it excruciating to sit still for long periods of time. So when I'm moving, my body is in a state of having to keep track of, not falling off the bike and making sure I don't get hit by cars, and where am I going to go again? What's the route that I'm taking? And oh, look, there's a cow, right? And it's distracted enough that I can finally focus, and I can finally think about ideas. And it's effortless at that point, because my brain, for whatever reason, can just deal with those questions that plague me all the time. Whereas if you ask me on the spot right now to think of an answer to a question, I almost always will come up with a jumbled, here's a thought, and here's a thought, and don't forget about this thing over here, because those are all happening in my head at once. And until I have something that is helping the back of my brain, occupy it, is like keeping a little kid, busy in the back of the classroom or something like that, or in your kitchen, so you can get something done. It's like keeping the back of my brain busy so that I can actually focus on other things in front, which isn't the case for everyone.
So, at first the question was, do we talk about how you choose problems, or how do you try to solve the problem? And for me, there's really no distinction. It's the same process. It's idiosyncratic because, mathematician, topologist have to do a lot of visualization. I really have to just be in a quiet place, not be moving, go into the zone. It takes about an hour of concentrated thought to get there. And then the closest thing I can compare it to is lucid dreaming, if you've ever done that, where you can just make all the colors move around.
The mathematical intuition is something like the vision of the...
Yes. And all practicing mathematicians know this and love this part of what we do, but we don't, it's very hard to teach, or we haven't figured out how to teach it.
So what,
But it's
what's
absolutely essential. You can't
what's
do anything
What's
without
an
it.
example of mathematical intuition, of a vision, of a theorem?
Well, there are famous stories. I mean, Poincaré, who you mentioned earlier, tells the story of working on this certain problem that's bothering him for months and months, and he doesn't know how to get past it. And I think, who was it? Maybe it was your point, Perry, about that when you're stuck and you've tried everything that's standard and you can't make progress, you need imagination. So Poincaré has an essay called something like The Psychology of Mathematical Invention, or some title like that, where he talks about, he's just bothered about it and he thinks about it all the time, and eventually he kind of gives up. But of course he hasn't given up. There's something happening subconsciously, I guess, and he's taking a bus ride and he steps off the bus, and at the moment he puts his foot off the step, he has a vision. And he knows in a flash that that will solve the problem. Even though no logical thing that he's aware of can tell him it will solve it, he can feel that he will solve it. I had one in my life that was unforgettable,
could
in a
you-
dream.
would you
I
tell
had been
us?
bothered about a certain problem in my area, coupled oscillators and synchronization, and I just couldn't understand the thing for the longest time. And then I had a funny vision while I was sleeping of certain fluids going around on a circle, and they were different colors, but they weren't mixing. And this picture, it turns out the fluids represented the different oscillators, which you could think of as like fireflies flashing, trying to get in sync. And some fireflies are intrinsically faster than others. The fast ones would be colored purple, because purple is like ultraviolet, which is a fast frequency in the electromagnetic spectrum. And the red ones are the slow ones, because that's low frequency, like infrared. And then these different fluids, these different frequencies of biological oscillators, I suddenly knew I have to think about this problem using the mathematics of traffic flow. That is, cars on the highway can be analyzed with partial differential equations that tell you is there a congested area of traffic here where it's all high density, and is there a rarefied, or gas dynamics, studying the flow of air or other gases. There's this whole mathematical apparatus that had never been used in my subject, but that existed, that's studied by civil engineers looking at traffic on the highway. And I realized once I thought of my oscillators as traffic swirling around on a circle.
It's an analogy. It all comes down
And
to
it's an
this
analogy, but it's it's a psychedelic analogy, because there's these multicolored fluids, because there are oscillators of different frequency and they don't mix. That is, the fast ones never become the slow ones.
So we just basically define imagination as the ability to represent things that aren't immediately present to your senses. So just think about that as and that could be lots of things, right? When the things that aren't immediately to your senses are about the future, then that's prospection. Prospection is like a subset of imagination. Perspective taking could be another thing. There's a whole bunch of processes. Daydreaming about your future, your personal future, would be another one. So there's a whole wide range of cognitive processes that fall under the umbrella of imagination. What sort of more circumscribed processes do you think that you use most in your own work? I'd like to at least put that question out there.
I like the idea of envisioning things that are not available to the senses, but I'm wondering whether that vision takes a particular form. What I'm thinking specifically about is that the space, that imagination in engineering and math often has a space associated with it. It is a space of how far into ideas you are going to go, but it also has boundaries. I see it as and that's why I call it a space, because it's not something that's there are walls.
How important is it that the idea is original? Like does it have to be different from what's already existed in the space?
For you to call it imaginative? I don't think so. I mean, when a student walks into your office and says, I think X, and you can tell based on their background knowledge that was a very imaginative statement for them to make, but everybody else already knows X, that doesn't mean that they lack imagination. They actually probably do have a very strong engineering or math imagination. It's just that they don't have the background knowledge to realize that that's already known. So I would definitely say that originality doesn't have to be associated with imagination. It's original in their own knowledge space. not in the general knowledge space.
Doesn't a lot of the world really not need imagination most of the time? I mean, it's nice to imagine things, but come on, get real.
I think I would say now more than ever we need more imagination in this world.
Yeah?
Because I think imagination is tightly linked to compassion.
Okay.
And that's sort of the angle I take with it.
That's a nice direction.
When we look at the imagination brain network, we find that it's tightly linked to the capacity to imagine the suffering of another person and
Nice.
then connect your
I like
own.
this.
Connect your own, in Marty's model of truth, in his model of the coherence of truth, connect your own meaning, your own personal life narrative to the suffering of someone else. If we can't make that connection, we see in the fMRI scanner there is zero compassion.
But maybe that's what we ought to be talking about. Not imagination for creativity, but imagination for empathy.
Making the world a better
Or sympathy
place.
or compassion. I mean, that seems like a somewhat different conversation, very important. I
Totally be
take your
down.
point about that.
Do you feel the competition to come up with a brilliant new idea or solve a long-standing problem in engineering/applied mathematics/philosophy/psychology enhances or stifles creativity in the field?
The academic system both, I think, inspires a lot of creativity and imagination, and also by the steps that one has to take, to the hoops that you have to jump through, so to speak, to sit at this table, collapses down and buffers creativity, right, to some degree, and the ability to really go off the wall unless you're very, very well established. I think there's a tension there, and so for younger scholars in their fields or interdisciplinary fields, it's difficult sometimes to go off on a limb without just appearing completely off the wall. And no matter how much institutions or institutes or individuals say they support diverse imaginative research and scholarship, when confronted with ideas that challenge the norm and their normative values, I think people retract. And I think we see that in academia.
In my first year, I had a mentoring committee. My first year on the faculty, I had a mentoring committee, and some of the advice that I was given is to make sure that you don't just pursue the one potential brilliant idea pre-tenure, but to pursue relatively straightforward ideas at a consistent pace for the 5 years, and hope to get one brilliant idea, but not to make that the focus. So there's definitely, is that an institutional barrier? I don't know, but it's definitely something that impacts the kinds of questions that are valued for you to address in order to make it in this particular field. Does it stifle creativity to ask somebody to look for the brilliant idea? I don't think so, unless somebody feels insecure that they can't get the brilliant idea and therefore they do feel stifled. But I wouldn't necessarily say that that's usually an institutional pressure. The pressure is more just to make sure that you don't attempt to be so creative that you don't do some very steady work.
I want to also put back on the table the social stereotypes that affect who is more likely to be perceived as doing hard science or hard thinking or rigorous thinking and squishy thinking. So there's a lot of data demonstrating that that people based on their name or their appearance or their ethnicity are perceived already as less rigorous, less prepared, less apt to come up with an original idea. And what does it mean what does that mean for each of our fields? So that's one element I think that reduces the fact that this happens, reduces the creativity possible in that field. The second thing is, given the advancing army of adjuncts and lecturers and non-tenure professors and the kind of overburdening them with teaching and not paying adequate salaries, so they pick up other jobs and they don't have time to settle into a space in which creative thinking is more likely. We have a class problem in academia. that limits its capacity, I think, for creative thought, and or privileges the creativity of an elite, an academic elite, when it shouldn't. I mean, how creative would we be, our fields, if those two things were not the case?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a barrier, not only for all the reasons that you described, but because there's been a lot of talk about, when we engage with other disciplines, that opens up a whole new way of thinking. It opens up a lot of new ideas, new solutions, new problems. And I think it's the same for social constructions, right? Class, right? The people who come from a certain socioeconomic class have one way of pursuing a problem versus people who come from, a different SES or a culture, right? Ethnicity versus whatever, life experience. And I think that certainly in the academic institution, you miss out on a lot of diverse thinking because you're not reaching whole sections of the population. It's very hard to get into certain schools unless you started in elementary school on that right path, or you knew the right person, right? Your family was connected in that way. I think that the evolution and the market and everything like that produces some exceptional individuals, but are those exceptional individuals the ones that had the great support networks? Or were they the ones that were the most creative, the most imaginative, the most accomplished even? Are they the ones that, their parents were able to get them through 3 years of unemployment so that they could then come back and apply for these jobs, or connect them to an awesome internship somewhere along the road so that they had the network to get in the door in the first place?
How important was collaboration in the process of developing your most imaginative idea? And when you meet a new potential collaborator, do you gauge that person's creative or imaginative capacities, and if so, how?
I think it's naive to think that you can always do the best work possible by yourself. I think that there are, in this room, for example, there are a number of different perspectives that I would not have by myself. And so I think you can do a lot of work by yourself. But is it the best work you could be doing? I mean, that's an open question, because sometimes I think you do better work by yourself, but other times you may need someone else to bring a diverse perspective or to untangle a problem that you don't have the right skill set to pursue, or just to provide relief pitching, right? Sometimes you just get stuck and tired of an idea.
I think it also depends on the nature of the task. Solving a particular equation is one thing. Getting a man on the moon, I don't think one man could have accomplished that. So it really is the nature of the task.
It's a funny aspect of collaborating in math where when it becomes the issue of what we were yesterday calling the technical part, actually solving an equation, say, I find it's worse to be collaborating at that point, that it's like collective stupidity. If someone's talking, or if we're both talking, or more than two of us are talking, it's really distracting and it's easy to be superficial. And it's best to just be quiet and go sit separately and think. Whereas in the idea generating phase, or even the question generating phase, then I find it very helpful and fun to be social and collaborative. So, but the nitty gritty, like the end game, there could be many end games. You solve this equation, and then that raises new questions, and then you're back into the opening rather than the end game. But still, for any of those places where the rubber meets the road in math and you're actually trying to do math as opposed to question generating, I think it's better to work by yourself because it's hard to concentrate deeply enough to get it right. I find it's very distracting in a good way, stimulating to be collaborating. One other aspect of collaborating that I was thinking about when you asked the question has to do with friendship and trust. that, especially in interdisciplinary work where you're a beginner, often in the most exciting kind. I mean, if you're in someone's discipline that's not your own and you really don't know much, you're very vulnerable. And so trust and friendship are helpful in terms of taking chances, like someone who's not going to actually make you feel stupid or poke you in some insulting way. So I have found that it works really well to like my collaborator.
I'm really curious whether most people in this room choose a potential collaborator because they think they're the most creative person out there, or whether you generally get a potential collaborator because they have a skill set you need.
I actually think it's the affection. You meet somebody and you think, I really like that person. I want to hang out with them. I like their ideas. Their ideas might have nothing to do with my ideas, but you enjoy spending time together and you enjoy talking. And then once you realize that that's happened, then you end up creating ideas together. It just happens naturally. But the first thing where it starts is actually just liking the person.
What if who you like for a collaborator, what if there's some kind of a miscalculation in the affection? So, for instance, the folks that I've collaborated with, or I've had collaborations in which I love hanging out with this person, but working with them turned out to be a really bad idea.
Yeah,
You know?
okay.
I mean, because for me, one of the things I need most out of a collaborator is not a new idea. I need openness, a willingness to think interdisciplinarily, to engage with new information as we're developing a project. But I need reliability and I need carefulness in a collaborator. Because if I have to bring all the reliability and the carefulness, the project itself is exhausting. So there is this tension, I think, between the creative and the careful, and the friendship and the work. I don't know. Is it fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think at least for me, the first project that I do together is based on the affection, and then the choice whether to continue to create more projects depends on more about the working relationship, which can be different. You're right.
I mean, there's this distinction in positive psychology between harmonious passion and obsessive passion.
What was the first one?
Harmonious passion, where you really are able to disconnect from it, so you don't have, if you work on something too much, you won't get returns on your investment at a certain point. So you're actually flexible to disengage and engage. Mm-hmm. And this research suggests that like harmonious passion is really what's conducive to high performance and stuff. But in almost every case when I talk to people who are really high performers like yourselves, or you produce a lot and everything, it seems to be more of this obsessive aspect to it. It's like harmoniously obsessive. It's like you love it. It's not that you're like out of control and you like it. Yeah. Which is different than the way it's portrayed in the literature, is like you're out of control and you don't want to be that way. But it's almost like you guys are a unique combination of obsessive.
Mania feels good. Absorb for a while.
Actually, I think that's a very interesting way to sum this.
I've never put it that way before, but I feel like
it's like we are harmoniously obsessive, passionate people.
Yeah.
Maybe that's
like you're irrational.
The recipe for creativity.
Yeah, you're not gamblers, or you're not like drug addicts, where like you really you'd like to stop.
Yeah, it depends on the day.
It does depend on the day, yeah.
Like you wish you could stop.
I think it's interesting the level of emotion that's involved in many of these processes. I mean, when we were talking about irrationality and passion, right? Passion is somewhat an emotional characteristic, and yet in mathematics and in many of the sciences and in engineering, emotion is generally undervalued, right? It's generally, one might even say, suppressed. It's considered inferior, not in psychology.
But by who? I
know
what you're saying.
Tradition.
Tradition
right?
says
tradition.
that. Yeah, that's all.
And so
a
what
lie.
is interesting to me is how often it's come up in these conversations, even with graphic design and color and, the military and, making decisions and the intuition. Like, these could be thought of as, we could do system 1, system 2, but you could also think of them as like an emotional reaction to a situation, to make a decision to study a certain topic. I think that's very fascinating. And again, maybe one of these underlying differences in people who think outside the box tend to do things that are off traditional paths, is that there is some passion, irrationality, emotion involved in the decisions that you do, or the pursuit, or the way in which you pursue something.
When you read the history of science, let's say, if we're sticking with science, read the real stories of Charles Townes or Art Winfrey or any of these people. They were all emotional. It doesn't mean they were blubbering. It means that they felt things. They were animated by desires. And then there's an issue of courage. There's a drive, but there's also the courage to let yourself feel what you feel and to act on it. Right? Courage is really, that's what Maya Angelou says, that the most important is courage.
We really want to talk about education right now and how to support more and stimulate more creativity in your own particular field. Now, Danny had a really good question to begin with in that vein.
So Steve had mentioned the fact that there are individuals who mentor their trainees in a way that seems to transmit the style of scientific inquiry. And you could imagine to some degree that they're also transmitting the style of choosing problems, imaginatively choosing them, imaginatively following them through, and then having good techniques to actually solve them at the end. So mentoring seems to be a way in which you can engender imagination or creativity in other individuals. Are there other methods, or do they all come down to mentoring? I'm kind of curious if we can talk about the methods for engendering imagination in younger students, and is there only one method, or are there multiple methods, and what do we each prefer to use? And questions like that.
The first of many goals is to inspire, motivate, give them the oomph they need so that they can work the rest out on their own through homework problems, etc. My lamentation earlier was the fact that these students were not yet at the point where they could go and work things out on their own or with any other help for the rest of the week. But when we're talking about university students, yeah, these are people who our time in class together is, I'm answering the question, why should you care about this? Why is this exciting? How does it fit into the grand scheme of this course? What happens to the characters in our story this week? And then, you've got some hard work to do to get through this week's homework assignments, and that's where you're really going to learn the details.
Yeah.
Do you actually use the characters in this story?
Yes.
Okay, interesting.
Yes, I do. And it's surprising how many students
grab that
resonates with.
Huh.
So who's a character? Like a derivative is a character, or who's a character? An object, a mathematical object?
When I teach single variable calculus, the first day of class, I introduce the main character, which is e to the x.
Oh, yeah.
A wonderful function, does a lot of good, has a real Bildungsroman story going through the entire course. He keeps coming back, playing a role. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting.
Very interesting.
I love it.
Description of imagination and creativity in education. Just to redefine what we view as the lesson, right? And to reshape it in terms of social constructs that we understand. Gives math, in your description, gives math an entirely different characteristic. No pun intended, right? Your characters have a personality to them. People can relate, right, presumably. When I was in physics in undergrad, it was, waves and optics, a class, and there's a lot of talk about omega, right? Omega, angular momentum, the baby omega, right? It looks like that. And when my professor first said omega, right, how do you pronounce this?
Omega tilde.
Omega tilde. He said it was called omega twiddle.
Yeah, some people.
Okay, right, and which I found the standard is tilde, twiddle. So the first time I was introduced to it was Omega Twiddle, and I kid you not, the first thing that popped into my head was a girl, fully formed, like curly hair with a bow in her hair. Her name is Omega Twiddle. So for the rest of the class, I had stories in my notebook written about Omega Twiddle and her best friend Tao. and like they went to the land of fee fi fo fum, right? Like all these different math jokes basically all the way through. It had nothing to do with the science, right? This is not relevant to what I was learning in class, but to me, like, that's actually what more of what I remember in my class is Omega Twiddle and the stories that I built around her. And to this day, it's sort of like this. I guess this is the first public forum I've discussed Omega Twiddle in, but like, it's been this in the back of my mind, the embodiment of love and science and sort of that childhood that is all Omega Twiddle. So now you know.
I think that many students really resonate with stories. They like the narrative approach. It is so not the norm in mathematics to teach it that way. We've just got flat content. Here's the list. Here's the outlines. All the trends are to modular content. Yeah. I just want to know what's an eigenvalue. Okay, so just watch this little thing, and then you got it. But you're missing out on all the connections, all the interrelations.
One of the ways I think Scott would characterize a default network is a personal involvement network.
Oh, yeah.
So you're taking the material, but you're merging it with your personal concerns. And in some ways, some of the ingredients that you're talking about move the material into the default network, if I'm hearing the metaphor.
I also like the fact that if that's involved in a course where you meet twice a week or 3 times a week, you can get people addicted to the personalities the same way they are to their favorite TV show, right? Because they can't get all of it at once. You won't sit there and lecture at them for 24 hours, right? You have 50 minutes or you have 75 minutes or whatever it is. And so they get their like bit of the story and then they have to wait. They have to sit there and wait for 2 days or 5 days or however much it is. And so then there is something about the current course structure of not being every day and not being completely immersive that can cause a sort of, again, we're getting back to the idea of obsession, I think, an obsession because you're fascinated and yet you have to wait, and then you're fascinated and you have to wait.
A student that is working in one of my classes, no matter for what motivation, is working hard. They are physically active in this course, and I want to take advantage of that because there's an activity there that goes way beyond the kind of physical activity you put into reading a book or watching a movie. I don't think that's really been explored. I would like to explore that.
I think there's falling in love with the subject and then learning the subject. So this seems like an important device minimally for making people more likely to fall in love with the subject. Once you love the subject, then the hard part, the learning, is going to happen anyway through whatever method.
I was going to add that as far as increasing imagination, certainly this project will do that. I also think that if imagination is the projection of what hasn't been yet, one of the things you have to do is you have to make a student see themselves almost as you or as doing what you do, and think that that's possible, to imagine themselves in your shoes. And I think this is a very effective way to generate imagination and creativity in a young person. And I think the way, but how do you do that? I think it means not communicating merely content. So this is kind of another way of not communicating merely content, but communicating stories of how you've come to an idea or how you worked through a setback in a problem, or how to tell what's behind the material for you. And then when you communicate that, first of all, the material becomes personal within the body of the teacher, within the life of the teacher, and then the hope is that the student can see themselves become you, or experience things that way, or struggle in that way, and they don't think there's just this material, I just have to somehow achieve it, understand it, get it, but that there is always a story with the teacher coming to this material, and therefore there is a story waiting to be told about the student coming to the material, working through the material, and therefore for me, I say modeling. This is different than mentoring, because you can model to people who are not your mentees, and this is a way to create the inspiration, right? If you can model some of these things, and or if you can't do it, point them to somebody who they can say, "Wow, I can imagine being them someday."
There's a subtle dimension to it that I have had grad students tell me that they decided they think they should give up because they will never love the subject the way that I do. That I'm a negative model for them, in fact.
But I think this is a perfect example. If students say, I will never be like you, so I'm just going to tank this, which I've also seen that. But part of, I think, this is where the value of a diversity of models comes in, and communicating that your field doesn't see things, that not everyone in the field sees things the same way, does things in the same way, has the same styles, has the same practice or commitment, or that there are many sorts of ways to do this, and this is how I do it, but this is how this person does it. You should go talk to them, and see if, and this is why the diversification of styles, people in the field, I think will enhance the inspiration, imagination of students.
I think what you're saying is give the person enough options so that they can see themselves in the situation, right? And they're not just saying like, oh, there's me, and then there's mathematicians. Or
Feynman. That's what I think is so bad about Feynman.
Someone else, but rather like, oh, we share these characteristics. And I think that is an interesting way of thinking about the narrative, and a powerful relationship or effect it might have on a student if they can see themselves in that role.
I'm always curious. We ask participants sort of what are the sacred cows in your discipline, like what values do you hold above others, or even what is it that you're in pursuit of by engaging in this field. And I think it was Christy yesterday who said something like we're always like in pursuit of truth. But then I think later you said actually it's more insight. And I just wonder if clearly identifying some of those can also help us understand motivators and ways to engage students who may also be very interested in, say, engaging in math or engineering in order to pursue things like truth or insight.
In the math world, we at some point start to revere beauty. You'll hear mathematicians talking to each other a lot about beauty. Truth, of course. We don't want our theorems aren't really beautiful. You could have beautiful wrong results, but generally we're not so interested in those. We care, they have to be true, but we're especially interested in beauty as professionals. However, so I would say beauty is a sacred cow for us. But what I think is interesting about that is that it is not for little kids. When you're trying to get kids interested in math, if you start talking to them about how beautiful this or that thing is, that doesn't connect. I've tried it with my own kids. That doesn't connect at all. A lot of kids are very interested in what I would call satisfaction in math. That is, if a kid likes math, I have found what they usually like is that it feels good to get it right, that it worked out. I did the thing I was supposed to do and I got it right. And that's very motivating for the kids I have worked with that are young. And so to talk about the beauty, this or that is beautiful, that's something that if it happens at all, it happens later. And so I wonder, whereas professionals aren't super interested in getting it right in the way that a kid means.
I thought math was beautiful when I was a kid.
As a young kid?
As a young
very
kid.
good.
I didn't understand it, okay? And I didn't have anyone to explain it to me. But I thought certain numbers and certain things that I saw were exquisitely beautiful,
wow.
just elegant.
Oh,
and
interesting.
But I didn't understand them. So
but you
like
did.
I think it was naive.
I would be careful about any sacred cow, because if a person doesn't know to worship it or can't relate to worshiping it, I don't know. I think it's
You guys all
very
seem to
distancing.
identify with the beauty one, though. As
Yeah.
at least one of the.
We do now that we get it.
Yeah.
Different people get it at different times, and some people never get it. I mean, you can trust me, many people have no idea if you say math is beautiful. They don't know what you're talking about. What comes up in engineering? I mean, anyone want to speak for the engineers? What's the sacred cow? Beautiful design, efficient design, clever solution to a problem, elegance? Or I don't know. What do you
Efficiency.
think? Efficiency.
I don't know. I think depends on the type of engineer. I think making it work right and work well is
Right.
maybe
That's like
lauded,
truth for
right?
math.
Yeah, like at the best. I think it was you that was saying something about building, right? For an engineer, it is the building, and if you want to say it's impossible, okay, fine, I will just go build it, right? So doing it, making it work well, but I don't know. I mean, I'm a non-traditional engineer, so I don't know. I value beauty a lot and
Okay.
truth a lot, and I don't know that I fit into the. I mean, it's an interesting point, right? Like, because I value those things, I do kind of feel outside the standard domain of engineering, and I think it boils down to that.
Let's imagine that we're overhauling the engineering curriculum at Penn or at Cornell or at Hampshire or at whatever university we're in. We have an extra slot for a course in freshman year. And we want to know how do we use that first course in order to create the most imaginative engineers or mathematicians at the end of a 4-year degree?
Yeah, I guess off the top of my head, I would be rather partial to the kinds of things that Steve was talking about earlier, a very hands-on, explorative, do things, build things, work.
So building intuition through play-ish.
Yeah, especially if we're talking about engineering and the engineering
or
curriculum.
math. So people
math.
who might not like to play in front of other people.
Well,
Or maybe all of us like to play in front of other people. I don't know.
I'm
an open question.
drawn to the tactile, the make things, build things in a group or by yourself as a way of sparking creativity. I could see that being valuable.
Like if you wanted to teach the 10 techniques of being creative in science, or broader than science, list a few that have worked historically. And then, so case studies, but then you could imagine in a course doing that. Like this week, and then I don't know what the exercises would be, but if you could think of clever activities or exercises where you don't know what the answer is, but I don't know. I mean, but I think it has to be something active. I don't think just reading about how the great creative people created. I still feel it's very stultifying. Yeah. You want to try your own hand at it a bit.
I like the history of it because then you capture that there is possibility that things have in fact moved dramatically. There's something. Speaking of capturing the imagination, the history of science, fantastic. So having that history, I think it would certainly be in the midst of here are some creative techniques and here's some practical play.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I try to do everything. Some people are fired up by history. Other people are bored by history. Some people want applications. Other people like logical purity. They want to see a beautiful argument from the beginning to end. Some people are competitive. They just want to be fast. And like if there are people who will love it if you teach them a multiplication trick to multiply two-digit numbers in their head very fast so they can show off to their friends. That's very motivating for some people.
There are a lot of freshman classes that many universities have developed over a long history to sort of sometimes it's called freshman seminar. Sometimes they have all sorts of different names to sort of open their eyes and prepare them for what the next 4 years is going to be. I mean, obviously, I'm just speaking as an academic because I'm thinking of a class, but I do like the idea of coming up with a class for freshman year and the first semester of freshman year that could target creativity early. And then the nice thing about that is that then you can also follow how that impacts on the academic achievement and other achievements, non-academic, over the next 4 years.
If the students are just given activities, like in my class with the kids that hate math, I'm always giving them the problems, the activities. They never come up with the problem. Why not? Why don't we do that?
But is it a problem that has a right answer?
No.
Because I think
in my case, usually,
right.
yes.
Because another question
may have
is
several right answers, several routes to the right answer.
Because
So
right
a
answer.
course on asking the right question.
Yeah, what about asking the right question? Has that ever been tried?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Because it's never
Sort of
framed
with a
that way,
history
right?
of people asking the wrong questions.
Yeah.
And then someone comes along and asks the right
A
question.
course on questions, right ones and wrong ones, and how to know. That would be fun to think about.
My first reaction to it was having, basically asking students to start a project that was personally significant to them. Because I think the motivation involved in doing something where you're trying to change the world in a way that you think is valuable, whether that's adding more art to math or whether that's, I don't know, coming up with a way to build cheap houses in war-torn countries or something, right? Finding something that's personally, maybe it's much more local than that, like designing a better chair to sit in during class. But I think it motivates people and inspires them and pushes them creatively in ways that they wouldn't necessarily do in a class for an assignment or something like that, because they know the parameters of, they're interested in the parameters of what they want to solve. They're personally invested in figuring out how to get over those obstacles and be resilient, right? So I think for me it would be asking.
Now, would the kids pitch their own problems and ask, then maybe other kids would decide if they want to work on the thing they themselves originally pitched or join someone else's team?
That would be a good idea, because I also think there are some people who, when motivated by their own question, also feel more constraints because they really want to get it right and they understand more about what the problem actually is. Whereas sometimes I think, as an undergraduate, some of my more creative work was done in classes that were sort of tangential to what I was actually supposed to be focusing on.
Yes.
But I think I felt freer there.
Exactly.
I wasn't
Isn't
so
that
committed,
interesting? Yeah.
and so then I could be a little bit more
You're looser
imaginative.
and more imaginative.